Just a nurse. That was what they all saw when Laura Bennett pushed through the double doors of Oak Creek Memorial at 6:47 in the morning, her badge clipped to scrubs that had been washed so many times the blue had faded to the color of old denim. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in plastic, and the smell of antiseptic burned her nostrils the way diesel exhaust used to burn them in Kandahar. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. The routine was muscle memory now: punch in, swallow the weight of 3 years of secrets, move forward with the precision of someone trained to stay calm when everything around her burned. Her shift started in the supply room, where the oxygen tanks gleamed like chrome bones and the shelves stretched toward the ceiling in perfect geometric rows. Laura organized the medication carts with the same methodical attention she'd once used to clean weapons under moonlight, each item placed at precisely the same angle, each label facing forward. The younger nurses called her steady. The older ones simply trusted her. Nobody asked questions about the woman who never complained, never raised her voice, never ate lunch in the break room where conversations twisted toward gossip and small talk. She moved through the ward with her head slightly down, her movements economical and controlled. Every step was exactly where it needed to be. No wasted motion. No drawing attention. At the nursing station, she pulled the surgical charts for the morning rounds, her eyes moving across the pages with the focused intensity of someone trained to spot inconsistencies that others missed. The billing codes were a language, a pattern, a system begging to be decoded. There, line 4 on the Marcus Coleman intake from 3 weeks prior. A level 5 laparoscopic cholecystectomy coded as level 3. $1,700 inflated to $5,200. She made a small notation in the margin and flagged the chart for the compliance office. Not her department. Not her problem. But she saw it the way she'd been trained to see: gaps in the narrative, fissures in authority, the places where things didn't add up. The third chart she reviewed that morning contained another irregularity. This one was subtler. A post-operative imaging code bundled with a surgical consultation that had never been documented in the chart notes. She flagged it the same way: small, precise, the kind of notation that would disappear into bureaucracy unless someone was actually looking for it. Then she shelved the charts and walked toward the locker room, her shift still 40 minutes away from starting in the trauma bay. The locker room was empty at this hour, just rows of cold metal and the smell of old coffee and hand sanitizer. Laura opened hers, locker 42, third row, corner position where she could see anyone approaching, and hung her bag on the hook. At the bottom, on top of her street shoes, sat a pair of combat boots. The leather was battered like old stone worn smooth by centuries of wind. The laces were military-grade tan, and the soles still carried traces of dust from a place that officially no longer existed in her personnel file. Kandahar. The name hung in her mind like a frequency no one else could hear. She reached down and touched the leather once, her fingertips recognizing the texture the way a blind person recognizes a face. Then she closed the locker door. Her hands were scarred. The scars weren't obvious, they didn't form dramatic lines or tell a story to someone glancing at them. But if you looked closely, if you understood what you were seeing, you'd notice the thin white lines across her knuckles, the subtle damage consistent with having hands restrained by zip ties pulled tight enough to cut off circulation. That had been a Thursday in a basement in Islamabad, 14 years ago, before the records were erased and she was ordered to become someone else. Before the daughter. Before the scrubs. Before Oak Creek Memorial. Trauma Bay 3 was already filling with the morning's first cases when she arrived. A 73-year-old with acute appendicitis. A 41-year-old with a strangulated hernia. The usual choreography of controlled emergency. Laura was preparing the suction setup at Station 1 when she heard the voice behind her. "You're efficient." She turned. Dr. Hargrove stood in the doorway, his surgical scrubs pristine in a way that suggested they'd been put on 5 minutes ago. He was tall, which meant he carried his height like authority. His jaw was sharp, his eyes were sharp, and there was something in the set of his shoulders that told Laura he expected people to notice when he entered a room. He was holding her flag chart in his right hand, his fingers tapping against the paper. "I try to follow protocol," Laura said. Her voice came out measured, respectful, the way a junior staff member speaks to a department head. No edge. No implication. Just the right amount of deference. "How long have you been at Oak Creek?" he asked. 3 years, she said. "And you've been working trauma?" 2 of those 3 years. He smiled then, but it was the kind of smile that didn't warm his eyes. It was a smile that calculated. "Steady hands," he said, looking at her wrists. His gaze lingered for just a fraction longer than it should have, and something in Laura's core registered the moment as a threat assessment. He was looking at her the way a predator looks at something that moves differently than it should. "That's useful in this department. Keep it up." He walked away before she could respond, and she returned to organizing the suction setup, her breathing unchanged, her pulse steady as a metronome. Around her, the ward continued its morning rhythm. The ventilators wheezed their mechanical breathing. The monitors beeped in their various syncopated patterns. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like a frequency designed to keep people slightly off balance. But that wasn't the worst part. The attendings' lounge was where the senior staff gathered between surgeries, a grey room with a single window that faced the alley and a refrigerator that perpetually smelled like forgotten yogurt. Laura had been there exactly once in 3 years, to retrieve a charger someone had left behind. Now she was passing the open door when she heard Hargrove's voice, speaking clearly enough to be heard over the soft country music playing from someone's phone. "I'm willing to make a wager," he said. She should have kept walking. She did keep walking. But some part of her, the part trained to gather intelligence, made her slow her pace. $500, Hargrove continued. "Says the new supply nurse, Bennett, she quits within 7 days. Tops. She's got the look of someone who knows she doesn't belong here." There was a pause. Then laughter. Not all of it was cruel, but most of it was. "You're serious?" A female voice, Dr. Patel, the general surgeon who actually worked rounds. "Why would she quit?" "Because she'll realize she's out of her depth. It happens. You get someone who's good at routine, who follows procedures, thinks that's enough. Then they get into the actual work, the decisions that matter, and they freeze. I've seen it 100 times. More laughter. A male resident said something Laura didn't catch. Someone accepted the bet. She continued down the hallway, her pace unchanged. Her breathing unchanged. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the accumulated pressure of a woman who had spent 14 years not being who she actually was, compressing herself smaller with every passing day, and now being assessed by a man who saw only surfaces. The morning shift proceeded with the steady choreography of trauma medicine. Intake. Triage. Initial assessment. Medication preparation. Laura moved through each sequence with the precision of someone for whom efficiency wasn't a skill but a fundamental architecture of existence. A 68-year-old with a myocardial infarction came through at 7:15. A 32-year-old motorcycle accident at 7:40. A 24-year-old with a gunshot wound to the abdomen at 8:12. Around 8:30, during the brief lull between cases, one of the junior nurses, Christina, a girl who couldn't have been more than 26, approached Laura at the medication station. "I saw you preparing the epinephrine drawers earlier," Christina said. Her hands were shaking as she asked the question. "I'm always so slow with those." "You make it look easy." "It's not easy," Laura said. "It's just repetition. You're thinking about each step. Eventually, your hands remember, and your mind can focus on what matters." "How long did it take you to get that fast?" Laura prepared the next medication without looking up. "Longer than you'd think. But less time than you have left to learn. You'll get there." It was the longest conversation she'd had with anyone at the hospital outside of direct medical necessity. Christina looked surprised, then grateful, and returned to her station with something like confidence restored. By 9:45, Laura had reviewed for more surgical charts and flagged 2 additional billing irregularities. By 10:30, she'd assisted on 3 procedures and spoken fewer than 60 words to human beings. The silence was safety. The silence was invisibility. The silence was survival. At 1 o'clock, her shift ended. She changed out of her scrubs in the empty locker room, pulling on the civilian clothes that were supposed to make her into someone normal. Jeans. A grey t-shirt. An old denim jacket with the sleeves rolled once. She looked at the combat boots one more time, then closed the locker and walked out through the main entrance into the Denver afternoon. Her daughter was home by the time she arrived, sprawled across the couch with a biology textbook and a protein bar, her school uniform still partially intact, blazer on the armchair, tie unraveled but not yet removed. Sarah was 16, and she had her father's eyes, which meant she had eyes that noticed when things were wrong. "How was work, Mom?" Sarah asked, not looking up from her textbook. "Fine," Laura said. She set her keys on the kitchen counter, deliberately ordinary, deliberately present. "Same as always." "How was school?" "Fine. I got an A on the chemistry quiz I was worried about." "That's excellent." Laura moved into the kitchen and began the evening routine, checking what was in the refrigerator, considering what dinner would be, performing the 1,000 small actions that constituted a normal mother with a normal job. "I'm proud of you, Mom." Sarah sat up now, the textbook sliding onto the couch cushion. "Is everything okay? You seem, I don't know, different today." Laura paused with her hand on a bell pepper. The ability to lie had been trained into her like a second language, but there was always that moment, that split second when a child's perception cut through the armor and Laura had to choose between telling the truth and protecting the fiction. "Just a long shift," she said, turning back to the vegetables. "One of the attending physicians is new to the department. Taking some adjustment." It wasn't a lie. It was a careful selection of facts that happened to be true while obscuring the deeper reality. It was the kind of lie that had become so familiar it was almost indistinguishable from the truth. Sarah returned to her textbook, satisfied. Dinner was chicken and rice and steamed broccoli, prepared with precision and eaten at the small table with the light from the window catching in Sarah's hair that was exactly the color of Laura's hair 14 years ago, before the gray started coming in and before Laura learned to hide herself so completely that even her reflection sometimes felt like a stranger. By 8 o'clock, Sarah was in her room doing homework. Laura stood at the kitchen window looking out at the Denver evening, the city lights spreading across the darkness like a constellation that had fallen to Earth. Her phone buzzed. A text from the hospital, from the trauma bay coordinator, Dr. Hargrove called. "He's requesting your schedule for the week." The message contained no punctuation and no explanation. It was simply a fact. A change. A marker that something had shifted. She didn't respond. She simply set the phone down on the counter and continued looking out at the lights, her expression unchanged, her breathing steady, her hands folded together in a way that hid the scars from the zip ties that had been cut away 14 years ago in a basement that was no longer supposed to exist. The morning after her shift, Laura stood in the attendings lounge while Dr. Hargrove reviewed patient files, his voice cutting through the quiet like a scalpel. "I'm giving Bennett 1 week before she quits," he said, loud enough for 6 residents and for nurses to hear. $20 says she can't handle the pressure of real hospital work. Laughter rippled through the room, that particular cruel sound that only exists in hierarchies where someone has already decided you don't belong. Laura, entering to drop off lab results on the counter, took one measured breath. She met his eyes for exactly 2 seconds, held his gaze without flinching, then set the papers down and left. No response. No emotion. Just the steady click of her shoes on tile disappearing down the corridor. Hargrove's smile faltered slightly. He'd expected something: anger, defensiveness, maybe tears. What he got was silence, and somehow that was worse. The next day in the cafeteria, Laura carried her lunch tray past the resident tables. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in that particular institutional white that made normal people look sick. She'd chosen her route carefully, the long way around, but Hargrove was waiting. He stood from his chair as she passed, and his arm came up as if reaching for something on a shelf behind her. The contact was gentle enough to be deniable, just a bump. Just an accident. The tray tilted. Gravity did the rest. Soup splashed across the tile in a golden arc, salad scattered like confetti, a roll rolled toward the wall. The sound was tremendous, metal clattering, the sharp break of a ceramic bowl. Every resident at every table turned to look. Junior staff froze mid-bite, forks suspended. Hargrove stepped over the mess without slowing down, didn't apologize, didn't even acknowledge what had happened. Just kept walking like the wreckage on the floor had nothing to do with him. Laura knelt slowly. Her movements were deliberate, controlled, the way someone moves who has spent years in environments where sudden motion gets you killed. She picked up each item. A piece of lettuce. A cherry tomato. The broken bowl in 3 pieces. She wiped one escaped tear without breaking eye contact with the floor, her jaw tight, her breathing steady through her nose. A first-year resident named Chen moved to help, reached down with his hand extended, but Hargrove stopped him with a look, just a glance, just a micro-expression of disapproval. Chen withdrew his hand like he'd been burned. He sat back down and didn't look up again. Laura cleaned the mess alone while 23 people watched, and when she stood, her tray was gone, and her lunch was gone, and she walked to the bathroom to compose herself in a way that no one would see. The third incident occurred during chart rounds. The surgical team was assembled, Hargrove, for attending physicians, 3 residents, 2 medical students, and Laura standing at the edge of the group. She'd compiled the post-operative summary for a 67-year-old male admitted for emergency cholecystectomy, her notes meticulous and thorough. When Hargrove reviewed her file, she watched his expression harden. He turned the pages slowly, deliberately, as if searching for something. Then he snapped the binder shut and threw it. Not violently. Not in a rage. It was worse than that. It was controlled. Practiced. The kind of throw a predator uses when it knows exactly how far it can push. The binder splayed open, papers sliding across the polished floor, scattering like someone's life coming undone. "Pick that up, sweetheart," Hargrove said, his voice dripping with a condescension so thick you could operate in it. "And next time, try using complete sentences instead of whatever this chicken scratch is." The residents exchanged glances. Someone's pen clicked twice. The heart monitor at the nursing station beeped its relentless rhythm in the background, indifferent to human cruelty. Laura took one measured breath. She let a single tear escape, and instead of hiding it, instead of looking away, she wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Hargrove. Her eyes had changed. They were still blue, but now they were the color of ice over deep water, something vast and dangerous reflected in a thin transparent surface. When she spoke, her voice was quiet. It was soft. It carried the weight of 17 people who had depended on her in places where the wrong decision meant they didn't come home. "I've carried wounded men twice your weight through minefields, Doctor. Your disrespect weighs nothing." The silence that followed was absolute. It swallowed the room like a held breath, like the moment before an IED detonates. Hargrove's smile vanished for exactly 3 seconds before returning twice as cold, his jaw clenched so tight you could see the muscle working under the skin. He opened his mouth to respond, closed it, then turned and walked away without a word. The residents didn't move. The medical students stared at their clipboards. Someone's beeper went off and nobody answered it. Laura bent down and began collecting her papers, her hands steady as surgical lasers, and nobody moved to help and nobody dared speak. When she was done, she stood, tucked the binder under her arm, and walked past Hargrove without looking at him. But that wasn't the worst part. Over the next 3 days, Hargrove started calling her sweetheart in every interaction. Every single one. "Good morning, sweetheart, can you grab me those x-rays, /sweetheart, I need you to restock the crash cart, /thank you, sweetheart, for that inferior work on the chart." Each repetition was a knife, and each knife was wrapped in a smile. He was baiting her, trying to provoke an outburst that he could document, something he could take to administration as evidence of her emotional instability. Laura didn't take the bait. She responded to his requests with "Yes, doctor," all right away, Dr. Orr, of course. Doctor, her voice neutral, her expression blank, her composure unbreakable. It was like watching someone punch a steel wall expecting it to hurt them. Eventually, Hargrove realized that public humiliation wasn't going to work. She wasn't going to quit. She wasn't going to break. She wasn't going to give him anything he could use. So he stopped trying to provoke her and started building something else instead. That evening, alone in the supply closet, Laura's hands began to shake. She gripped the metal shelf hard enough that her knuckles went white, hard enough that she felt the cold steel bite into her palms. Her breathing came faster, her chest tight, the old familiar panic climbing up her throat like something with claws. She closed her eyes and pulled herself back to center using techniques she'd learned in a basement in Kandahar that was no longer supposed to exist. 4 counts in through her nose. 7 counts holding. 8 counts out through her mouth. In. Hold. Out. She did it again. And again. And again until her heart rate dropped from 142 to 98 to a steady 72, until her breathing regulated, until her hand steadied and the trembling became a distant echo of itself. She looked at her palms. The red crescents where her fingernails had pressed into the skin. Old scars from zip ties cut away 14 years ago lined her wrists like a faded map of survival. She tucked her hands into her pockets, straightened her scrubs, and left the supply closet looking like someone who had never been afraid of anything in her life. But Hargrove wasn't in his office planning his next insult. He was on his private cell phone in the corner of the physician's parking garage, making calls with the precision of someone executing a strategy. The first call went to board chairman Holloway, who owed him a favor from a case 3 years ago where Hargrove had testified on his behalf in a malpractice suit. "I'm concerned about one of my nursing staff," Hargrove said, his voice carefully measured. "Emotional instability. Unauthorized decision-making in patient care. I need this documented before there's an incident." Holloway, who knew what a favor being called in sounded like, assured him it would be handled discreetly. The second call went to Laura's listed references, 2 nurses who had supervised her at previous hospitals and who Hargrove reached by claiming he needed verbal confirmation of her employment history. "Just a formality," he explained, his voice smooth as oil. "Has she ever displayed signs of emotional instability? Questionable judgment." The first reference said no. The second, who Hargrove had already called ahead to warn that Laura might not be a good fit, hesitated just long enough for the implication to settle. That hesitation would be enough. The third call was to an outside medical review firm, the kind that existed in the gray space between legitimate oversight and strategic character assassination. "I'd like to request a credentialing review," Hargrove said. "Nursing staff member, 3 years of service, but I've noticed some concerning patterns in her chart work. I want it all documented." Cost wasn't discussed. These things never were when you had the kind of money that made problems disappear. He was building a paper trail, each call another brick in a wall designed to bury someone who had done nothing but notice irregularities in billing codes that amounted to roughly $847,000 in fraudulent charges over the past 18 months. While he made these calls, Laura was somewhere in the hospital checking on Marcus Rivera, the Navy SEAL patient in recovery, a man whose eyes tracked the room with tactical precision, a man who had spent 15 years in combat and never complained about anything, a man whose oxygen saturation was beginning to drop. Marcus lay in his hospital bed watching the clock on the wall move from 8:48 to 8:48, his breathing getting shallower, that tight feeling in his chest that started like anxiety and was becoming something else entirely. He'd had tension pneumothorax once before, years ago in Kandahar province, knew exactly what the sensation meant. Lung collapsing. Air in the pleural space. Maybe 15 minutes before his heart stopped. He reached for the call button, his hand moving in slow motion, everything suddenly heavy and distant. The room tilted slightly at the edges. He pressed the button twice, 3 times, but his vision was already starting to blur and he didn't know if he'd actually pressed it or just imagined the sensation. Somewhere down the corridor, the call light activated on the nursing station, but the unit was in shift change chaos, and it would be another 3 minutes before anyone noticed it, another minute after that before they realized where the light was coming from. 3 minutes. That's all it took to change everything. Marcus Rivera arrived at Oak Creek Memorial on a Tuesday morning, wheeled through the main entrance in a standard surgical recovery protocol following a minor arthroscopic procedure on his left knee. He was 52, built like someone who had spent decades conditioning his body into a weapon, and he communicated through a laminated communication board and a notebook filled with precise, economical handwriting. The chart noted he was a retired Navy SEAL, nonverbal due to a throat injury from an IED blast in 2009, and that he preferred minimal staff interaction during recovery. Laura Bennett was assigned to his room at 8:15 that morning, and she recognized something in his eyes the moment she entered, the same quality she saw in her own mirror. Hyper-awareness. The way he tracked her movement from the doorway to his bedside, assessing threat levels with the kind of precision that came from 27 years of operational training. She checked his vitals in silence, and when she wrapped the blood pressure cuff around his arm, he watched her hands. Not the way patients normally watched, curious, anxious. The way another operator assessed competence. When the reading came back 127/82, normal and steady, something shifted in his expression. Recognition, maybe. Or simply the understanding that he was in the care of someone who understood the difference between a safe room and a dangerous one. Over the next 2 days, Marcus and Laura developed a communication rhythm that required almost no words at all. She would enter his room, and he would write single words on his board: pain level, swelling, discharge timeline. His handwriting was precise as surgical sutures, each letter formed with military discipline. When she adjusted his full line, he didn't flinch. When she helped him to the bathroom, he moved with the controlled economy of someone trained to operate in absolute silence. Laura noticed how he positioned himself in the bed, always with his back to the corner, always with sightlines to both the door and the window. She noticed how his eyes tracked the nursing station through the partial glass partition. She noticed how he never truly slept, just closed his eyes and waited, breathing with the deliberate rhythm of someone in tactical rest mode. On the third morning, Dr. Hargrove appeared at 7:30 with a surgical team, announcing that they'd discovered an acute inflammatory response in Marcus's appendix on routine imaging, not emergent yet, but predictive enough to warrant immediate appendectomy. Better to take it out now, Hargrove said, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. We go in, we come out, crisis averted. He didn't ask Marcus's opinion. He simply handed him the consent forms and told him to sign. Marcus signed, then looked at Laura and nodded once, a gesture so subtle that only someone trained to read micro-expressions would have caught it. It meant, I trust you. It meant, don't let him kill me. The surgery was scheduled for 9 that morning, and Laura was assigned to the surgical observation gallery, a seat behind glass where she could watch the procedure unfold. Dr. Hargrove stood at the operative field with the confidence of a surgeon who had performed thousands of appendectomies, his movements efficient and practiced. The attending anesthesiologist maintained steady vitals. The surgical nurses moved through their choreography with the fluid precision of people who had worked together for years. At the 30-minute mark, a rotating military medical officer named Captain James Mercer stood across from Laura on the other side of the operative field, assisting the surgical team through their fellowship rotation at Oak Creek Memorial. He was a trauma surgeon with 3 tours in Afghanistan, and he had been trained to recognize competence the same way Marcus had. What he saw at minute 31 made him freeze. Laura had been watching the procedure dispassionately when Hargrove made a small technical error, a minor traction issue that required cleaning, and one of the surgical nurses reached for the appendix with a standard instrument. But the positioning was wrong. The angle was wrong. And without thinking, without raising her hand or speaking, Laura turned to Mercer and held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Not a blink. Not a signal. Just an understanding, transmitted across a sterile field, that said, that's not the right move. Mercer saw it. More importantly, he saw how she saw it. He watched as the surgical nurse corrected the positioning on her own, without Hargrove saying anything, and when suturing began, he watched Laura's body language with the kind of attention a combat operator reserves for threats or allies. The suturing technique that emerged over the next 12 minutes was wrong in every normal way. The knots were too tight, the spacing was too precise, the tension was too perfectly calibrated. It was the kind of suturing you learned in a field medical course designed for casualties who had to survive tactical transport through fire. It was the kind of suturing Laura's hands had performed while rounds were coming in and her patient was bleeding out, and the only thing between him and death was her ability to work faster than her own heartbeat. Mercer's hand stopped moving. His breathing changed. He looked up from the operative field, looked directly at Laura through the observation glass, and his mouth formed a single word that nobody could hear but everybody who understood would recognize: Kandahar. The world didn't stop. The surgery continued. But something shifted in the space between them, a recognition so profound it felt like decompression after an explosion. Laura didn't look away. She didn't acknowledge him. She simply turned her head slightly, a movement so minute it registered only as a change in posture, and stared at the operative field with the kind of intensity that transmitted a single message through the glass and across the surgical lights: bury it. Forget it. Don't say another word. Her eyes were the color of a winter storm over the Atlantic, and the message in them was the kind that career soldiers understood without translation. Some things stay buried. Some people stay disappeared. Some past stay classified. Mercer lowered his gaze back to the surgical field and continued working in silence, but his hands moved differently now, with the understanding that he had just seen someone whose official records, if they existed at all, were sealed behind enough security clearance that asking questions would end his career before it started. The surgery continued for another 30 minutes, and when Marcus was wheeled to post-op, his vitals were stable, his blood pressure holding at 119/78, his heart rate steady at 72 beats per minute. The appendectomy had been successful. The patient would recover. And somewhere in the back of Marcus Rivera's morphine-hazed consciousness, he would remember that the surgical team had worked with the kind of synchronized precision that only happened when everyone in the room was operating under the same level of training. When the nurse in the observation gallery had stared at the rotating military officer with the kind of command presence that belonged to someone considerably higher in rank than the administration thought she was. When something invisible had passed between two people who understood that they were looking at a legend, and that legends didn't come with name tags. Back at the surgical observation station, Laura remained in her seat for 30 seconds after the operative field was clear. She didn't move. She didn't check her phone. She simply sat with her hands folded and waited for her pulse to return to baseline. 60 beats per minute. Her breathing followed suit, controlled and deliberate. The nurse beside her, a younger woman named Chen, fresh out of her nursing degree, glanced over and said, "That was beautiful surgery. I want to work at that level someday." Laura didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stood slowly, smoothed her scrubs, and said nothing at all. Some compliments didn't require acknowledgement. Some things were understood. She walked down the observation gallery stairs with the kind of posture that made people instinctively step out of her way, even though she moved at a normal pace and showed no aggression whatsoever. It was simply the quality of someone whose presence made the air pressure change when they entered a room. When she reached the corridor outside the surgical suite, she found Mercer waiting by the emergency stairwell. He was still in his surgical cap and mask, pulled down around his neck, and his eyes carried the weight of a man who had just realized he worked in the same hospital as a ghost. "I didn't," he began. Laura stopped him with a single raised hand. "No. You didn't." Her voice was pitched low, calm as ice water. "You don't know what you thought you saw. You don't know my suturing technique. You don't know anything about me beyond what's in my personnel file and what you saw in a surgical observation gallery." She moved closer, and when she spoke again, each word carried the kind of finality that left no room for misunderstanding. "Captain Mercer, some operations don't have names. Some people don't have ranks. Some records don't exist. Do you understand?" He nodded slowly. "Then we're finished with this conversation." She turned and walked toward the post-op recovery area without waiting for a response. The hallway smelled of antiseptic and the faint metallic tang of blood, and when she pushed through the double doors into Marcus's recovery bay, she found him waiting. His eyes were open. The morphine had made them glassy but not absent. He looked at her, and his hand moved slowly toward the communication board. Laura gently placed her palm over his wrist and shook her head once. "Rest," she said softly. "You're safe." He nodded and closed his eyes, and for the first time since his arrival at Oak Creek Memorial, his shoulders relaxed completely into the bed. He believed her. And that belief, Laura understood with sudden clarity, was about to cost her everything. Marcus Rivera's chest wasn't moving right. Laura saw it the moment she entered his room for routine vitals, the asymmetrical rise and fall, the way his left side lagged a half-breath behind his right. She moved to his bedside without calling out, her hands already reaching for the blood pressure cuff when she noticed the trachea, subtle but unmistakable, drifting toward his right shoulder like a compass needle pulled off true north. Jugular veins distended. Skin the color of wet concrete. Tension pneumothorax. Not maybe. Not probably. Certain. She'd seen this exact presentation once before, but that time the sound of mortar fire had been rattling windows 3 blocks away and she'd been working with a field dressing and whatever instruments lay closest to hand in a burning clinic outside Kandahar. 40 seconds to decompress all the patient coded. 40 seconds then too. I need a 14-gauge needle. Now. Her voice came out flat, certain, the kind of voice that made residents move before their brains caught up to the order. A nurse's aide fumbled through the crash cart, but Laura was already moving, already reaching. She found the needle herself, knew exactly where it would be, knew the weight of it, the feel of the plastic hub against her palm like muscle memory in its purest form. The resident covering the ward looked up from his laptop. His O2 was fine on rounds. It's dropping. Look at the monitor. Laura was already prepping the injection site, second intercostal space, midclavicular line. The anatomy had a rhythm to it, a map written in ribs and cartilage. Where's the attending? Surgery. He's scrubbed in trauma bay 2, maybe 10 minutes out. We don't have 10 minutes. She didn't look at the resident, didn't waste breath explaining what he should have already seen. The attending would arrive to find a saved patient or a code she'd initiated. Either way, the choice was made. The needle went in. 2 inches of metal through skin, through tissue that had no right to resist her now, not now, and then the hiss, the beautiful hiss of air escaping, of pressure releasing like a valve opening on machinery that had been running too hot for too long. O2 sat climbed. 72, 78. 84. The monitor's rhythm steadied from the jagged panic of insufficient oxygen into something approaching normal. Marcus's chest rose and fell equal on both sides now, symmetrical, the way lungs were supposed to work when you had time and training and nerve. The attending arrived 90 seconds later, already reaching for the needle Laura had already placed, already starting to explain the procedure she'd already executed. He stopped mid-motion, reading the monitor, reading the patient's improved status, reading the 14-gauge angiocath needle positioned with the precision of someone who'd done this under conditions that would have made this fluorescent-lit recovery room look like a luxury resort. You decompressed him. Tension pneumothorax. Needle decompression at the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. O2 sat recovery starting at mark 40 seconds. Laura kept her voice level, clinical, the voice of someone reporting facts to someone else with ears to hear them. The attending nodded slowly, not questioning, not challenging. He'd seen competence before. This was something else. This was the kind of precision that came from somewhere deeper than a nursing license. Marcus looked at her. His hand moved across the communication board he kept on the bedside table, the one he used since the Kandahar incident that had taken his voice but apparently not his ability to judge character, and he typed 3 words, "Thank you." Saved. Laura's jaw tightened, but she nodded. Professional. Distant. The mask stayed in place. It had to. But Marcus knew. Something in his eyes said he understood exactly what had just happened in this room, understood that the woman adjusting his oxygen flow had skills that belonged to a different world than vital sign checks and bedpan changes. Dr. Hargrove arrived 30 minutes later, summoned by the attending to review what had happened. He stood in the doorway of Marcus's room, reading the chart, and something shifted in his expression. Not shock exactly. Calculation. The look of a man watching a threat he'd underestimated suddenly revealed its full dimension. Laura was documenting the needle decompression when Hargrove's shadow fell across the computer screen. That was an emergency procedure. Outside your scope. She didn't turn around. Patient was coding. Attending was unavailable. Protocol is to stabilize. Protocol is to call for an attending first. His voice had dropped lower, more careful now, the tone of someone measuring his words. He understood, Laura realized. He understood that she'd just demonstrated competence so absolute that it made her previous months of careful documentation, flagging his billing codes, marking his surgical inconsistencies, look like the work of someone with medical training most nurses didn't possess. Someone with training most people didn't possess. Someone dangerous. He left the room and made 3 phone calls from his office within the hour. Laura knew because the resident started avoiding her, because the nursing supervisor suddenly had new scheduling priorities, because the whisper network that moved through any hospital like electricity through copper began to hum with new frequencies. By day's end, Hargrove had contacted the 3 board members he'd cultivated over 6 months of careful socializing, board members who owed him favors, who'd accepted his invitations to private dinners where billing was discussed in the abstract, who'd signed off on coding adjustments that had funneled slightly less than his projected $847,000 annual fraud into accounts they couldn't quite trace. The calls went out. References from Laura's previous position suddenly received inquiries from credentialing investigators asking pointed questions about emotional stability, about incidents that didn't exist, about patterns that had never materialized. Hargrove's voice on those calls was smooth, helpful, concerned, a colleague checking on a colleague, nothing official, just wanted to make sure the right hiring decisions were being made. His fabrications had the texture of truth because he'd practiced them, because he understood that human beings believed stories that sounded like they came from people who already knew things. By evening, a formal credentialing investigator had been retained by the hospital, an outside firm that specialized in personnel evaluation, the kind of neutral third party that looked objective as long as you didn't know who was paying them. Hargrove hadn't explicitly requested the evaluation. He didn't need to. His board members had mentioned concerns, and concerned board members with liability anxiety were the institutional equivalent of gravity. Things fell in the direction they were weighted to fall. Laura finished her shift at 6 p.m., didn't notice the email that arrived at 6:08 requesting her presence in the administrator's office at 8 a.m., didn't know that Hargrove had spent the last 4 hours on the phone with institutional lawyers, dignifying her heroism as recklessness, her competence as insubordination, her needle decompression as a crossing of professional boundaries that could expose the hospital to liability if the wrong attorney decided to press the matter. She drove home in her scrubs, the highway stretching out before her in the last light of an October evening, and she didn't yet understand that the ground beneath her was about to disappear. The administrator's office on the 7th floor smelled like old leather and industrial coffee, the kind that had been sitting in a carafe since dawn. Laura sat across from 3 board members whose names she'd learned in her first month at Oak Creek Memorial and never quite retained. Their faces carried the soft exhaustion of people who'd slept poorly, who'd been called into something they hadn't anticipated. Behind them stood a man in an expensive suit that didn't quite fit his shoulders, a credentialing investigator from outside the hospital system, his eyes carrying the flat professional distance of someone who'd done this before and would do it again. The folder on the desk between them was thin. Impossibly thin. "Your service record is exemplary," the board chair said, a woman named Coleman whose grey hair was pulled so tight it looked painful. 3 years without a single complaint. Evaluations consistently strong. That makes this difficult. Laura's hands rested in her lap, palms down. She'd learned years ago that still hands communicated control, that visible stillness meant invisible strength. The composure that had carried her through Kandahar mortar fire could carry her through this too. Just a different kind of fire. Dr. Hargrove filed a formal complaint regarding the events of October 16, the second board member said, pushing a single sheet across the desk with one finger as if the paper itself might contaminate him. Specifically, the emergency needle decompression performed on patient Marcus Rivera without physician oversight. The patient's lung was collapsing, Laura said quietly. His oxygen saturation was 62. "We understand the clinical urgency," the investigator interjected, his voice carrying the texture of someone reading from a script he'd memorized. "However, needle decompression is outside the scope of nursing practice in Colorado. Regardless of outcome, regardless of necessity, it constitutes practicing medicine without a license." The silence that followed tasted like pennies. Laura had heard this coming. The moment Marcus's chest began to re-expand, the moment she felt that hiss of trapped air escaping, the moment the pulse oximetry climbed from 62 to 84 to 91, she'd known. Hargrove's face in the doorway had told her everything. That look wasn't gratitude. That look was calculation. That was the face of someone who'd finally found his lever. "The hospital is bound by state regulations," Coleman continued, and Laura heard the apology buried in the formality of her words. "Your actions, whatever their motivation, created liability exposure. We cannot legally endorse, a nurse stepping outside her scope of practice, even in an emergency." "Even if it saved his life," Laura said. "Not a question." "The outcome doesn't change the violation," the third board member said, and he at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, but the board has voted. Effective immediately, your employment at Oak Creek Memorial is terminated." They slid the termination papers across. She didn't look at them. What they couldn't understand, was that she'd already survived worse decisions by better people. She'd sat in forward operating bases waiting for orders that would send her into fire that had no name, no justification that would ever be public. She'd held wounded men whose wives didn't know they existed. She'd buried friends in unmarked graves because the missions were too classified even for proper mourning. This was just another kind of disappearance. Laura stood without reading the paperwork. "I'll clear my locker." She walked down the corridor at 8:43 a.m., moving past residents who didn't meet her eyes and nurses who suddenly needed to check their phones. The staff locker room was empty, the fluorescent lights casting everything in that particular shade of institutional gray. Her locker was at the end of the row, locker 247, the same one for 3 years. Inside hung her spare scrubs, folded neatly. A photo from a hospital fundraiser where she'd managed to smile for the camera. And at the bottom, placed there on her first day and never moved, the pair of worn combat boots. The leather was cracked in places where it had been wet-dried and wet-dried again. The laces were frayed at the ends. The sole showed the particular wear pattern of someone who'd walked thousands of miles in mountainous terrain, who'd run, who'd crouched, who'd pressed against walls in corridors she would never officially acknowledge existing. Those boots had Kandahar dust embedded in the stitching. Real dust. She'd never washed them because washing them would mean accepting that those operations were over, that life was finished, that she was safe enough now not to need them. She picked them up. They were heavier than they should have been, weighted down with history. That evening, Laura sat at her kitchen table still wearing her scrubs, the clock reading 5:17 p.m. when it should have read 8:13 p.m. The kitchen was quiet in the way that only a house gets when someone is trying not to make noise, when the silence itself becomes a presence. Her daughter Melissa had texted from school at 3 p.m., a simple red apple emoji, her way of saying she was at volleyball practice, wouldn't be home until 6. At 5:34 p.m., a key turned in the front door. Footsteps. Quick ones. Volleyball practice had ended early. Laura heard the backpack drop, heard the jacket get tossed onto the hallway bench with the specific carelessness of a 17-year-old who believed her mother would pick it up. The footsteps changed direction. Melissa appeared in the kitchen doorway, her hair still in the elastic she'd put it in that morning, her face flushed from practice. Then she saw her mother at the table. Still in scrubs. Home when she should be in hour 3 of a 12-hour shift. The moment stretched like a rubber band pulled too tight. "Mom." The word came out small. Confused. "Why aren't you at work?" Laura had walked through 10-mile night navigation courses with broken ribs. She'd treated sucking chest wounds while rounds were still incoming. She'd been trained to compartmentalize pain, to function in chaos, to keep moving even when the ground beneath her was on fire. Nothing in that training had prepared her for the specific gravity of that question. She didn't answer immediately. Melissa moved into the room slowly, the way prey animals move when they sense danger, and sat down at the table without being invited. "Did you get hurt?" Melissa's voice was narrower now, sharper. "Are you sick?" "No." Laura's voice came out controlled, measured. The same voice she'd used on the ridge in Kandahar when men around her were dying and the only thing between them and death was her steady hands. But steady wasn't enough anymore. "I'm fine. Just a shift swap." The lie came out smooth because she'd had years of practice telling them. The lie landed hard because Melissa had learned to recognize them. "Mom," her daughter said, and Laura heard in that single syllable the collapse of something she'd built. "Don't lie to me." 3 years she'd worked at Oak Creek Memorial. 3 years of double shifts and weekend rotations, overtime and mandatory call-ins, all of it calculated toward one goal, a stable life for her daughter. A normal childhood where a mother came home from work and cooked dinner and asked about volleyball and college applications and didn't carry the weight of classified operations that could never be discussed, never be processed, never be properly mourned. Laura had promised herself and her daughter that the hiding was over. That she'd left that life behind. That the combat boots would stay in a locker while she became just a nurse in Denver, just a woman rebuilding something solid. The boots were on the kitchen counter now, still in her hands. "I was fired," Laura said, and the word fired fell between them like a stone into still water. "Today. This morning." Melissa's hands moved to her chest, fingers spreading across her ribs. Laura recognized the gesture because she'd taught it to her, a grounding technique from therapy. Her daughter was grounding herself because Laura's world had just fractured, and Melissa was terrified of what might come falling through the cracks. "Why?" Melissa whispered. "It's complicated," Laura said, and even as the words left her mouth, she hated herself for them. Because complicated was the excuse of people who didn't want to tell the truth. Because complicated was a parent's shield, and shields broke both directions. "I did something they said I shouldn't have. But I had to do it. And they fired me for doing it." Melissa's eyes filled but didn't overflow. Her daughter had learned that too, how to be strong in front of someone who needed strength, how to swallow down fear because someone else was falling apart. Laura was falling apart. She could feel it happening, the careful compartmentalization she'd maintained for 3 years beginning to separate. She'd kept the past in one box and the present in another, kept them so far apart they couldn't touch. But the boxes had started to blur. "We'll figure it out," Melissa said, and she sounded so young and so old at the same time. "Mom, we'll figure it out." But they both knew she was lying now too. 1 week passed in a particular kind of silence. Laura applied for 3 positions, at St. John's, at Cherry Creek Community Health Center, at Presbyterian. Each application hit the same wall. Background checks pending. References pending. Availability pending. The language was polite bureaucracy covering something more final. Someone had made calls. The kind of calls that made doors close quietly instead of slamming. She didn't leave the house much. Melissa went to school and to volleyball and to the library for homework, and Laura sat in the kitchen watching the coffee get cold and the day get darker. Her savings could carry them for 4 months. Maybe 5 if she was careful. Then the money would run out and the house would follow and Melissa would have to start over somewhere else, some smaller apartment in some worse neighborhood, and the promise of stability would become just another broken thing. She didn't know what was happening to Marcus Rivera. She thought about him during the nights when sleep wouldn't come, wondered if he'd recovered, wondered if he understood that the woman he'd recognized in Kandahar's shadows was now just another casualty, another disappearance, another life that had to be erased. She didn't know that in the Oak Creek Memorial Emergency Department, Marcus had requested specifically for Laura at his 2-week follow-up appointment. She didn't know that when told she no longer worked there, he'd gone completely silent for 14 minutes, his hand shaking so hard that his physical therapist had asked if he was in pain. She didn't know that every nurse who'd worked that shift was quietly passing around rumors, that Laura had been set up, that Hargrove had fabricated the complaint, that the whole thing smelled like political bullshit aimed at a person who knew something she shouldn't. She didn't know any of that. What she knew was that the combat boot sat on her nightstand now instead of in a locker, and that felt like surrender, and surrender felt like the most honest thing she'd done in 3 years. On October 24 at 7:42 p.m., Oak Creek Memorial's ER received an ambulance notification. Trauma incoming. Critical. ETA 7 minutes. The emergency team mobilized with the practiced precision of people who'd done this hundreds of times. The attending on duty was Dr. Sarah Chen, an emergency medicine specialist who'd heard all the rumors about Laura Bennett, who'd been on her shift the day Hargrove threw the chart, who'd witnessed the cafeteria incident and said nothing because saying something would have meant crossing a man with power. The ambulance doors burst open and the patient was wheeled out, a man with dark eyes and a face beaten into something unrecognizable, his left leg crushed, blood loss estimated at over 40% of his volume. He was conscious. His eyes were moving. And when those eyes found Dr. Chen, when they focused through the morphine haze and the pain, something shifted across his face. He began shouting. In Pashto first, the words coming fast and desperate and old. Then broken English, you the ghost. You the woman. Kandahar, you the woman soldier who pulled Commander Rashid from the fire. The trauma team froze for exactly 1 second. Dr. Chen, who'd served in the Navy before medical school, who knew the difference between confusion and clarity, felt her skin go cold. The man's hand reached out and grabbed the nearest nurse. Find her. Find Senior Chief. Find the ghost. Tell her Khalid Rayan is here. Tell her I am here. The trauma bay exploded into controlled chaos, lines being placed, blood being typed, surgical site being prepped. But in the background, Dr. Chen was already reaching for her phone. 3 years. 3 years of rumors and quiet knowledge. 3 years of wondering where the woman with the steady hands had gone. 1 phone call. Just one. Subscribe to the channel, like this video, and comment below. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? That's what Laura Bennett is about to discover happened to everyone she thought had fired her.